All right, welcome to week 2 of African American Studies 1501. I'm going to separate the videos this week up into 3 sections. And so this first one, I just wanted to give you some context. This week is really about framing some of the key terms and ideas that we're going to be using throughout the rest of the semester. Because this gives a lot of kind of definitions, it goes over some big concepts. I wanted to provide you with some slides here so that you can go back to this video if you need to review anything or if you want to use any of this language when it comes time for your paper or your essays or things like that. So, a few housekeeping things first. If you haven't had time already, please make sure you check out the WordPress site that we're going to be using for this course. So I put the title there. It's AFR1501.wordpress.com. We're going to be using that, I think, for the remainder of the semester. So I've recently just got access to Blackboard and to my email. So I will kind of set up Blackboard because we'll be using that likely for quizzes, exams, assignments, things like that. I'll also record your grades for assignments through there. I'll try to set that up in the next week or two. But in terms of how we're going to interact, I think WordPress is a lot more user-friendly. So I'll use that to continue to post things like these videos, to post your weekly assignments. You'll respond and do your posts on the WordPress site. So make sure you're checking that regularly, and then I will email you updates, but I'll also put those on the website as well on the homepage. Another announcement is I got an email today that CIS changed my email address. So you should be getting an email from me to let you know this. But I emailed you all Sunday and Monday night, and you may have sent me an email, but they have changed my address. So it's now here, what you see on screen. It's ybailey@citytech.cuny.edu. So make sure you use that email address. I'll put it on the syllabus as well. Speaking of the syllabus, I now have access to the online resources with the library. So what I'll be doing is finalizing our schedule. If you're like me, you like to have a whole schedule to know what you're going to be reading, what's going to be due. So I will finish that this week and I will have that posted to the website, and I'll try to put it on Blackboard or email it out as well by Sunday at the latest. So you'll get a good sense. I am going to talk to you in a little bit here about what we'll be doing each week, so I just want to give you a sense so you can really know if this course is something you're interested in. Couple of other things. Office hours, so I'll email you all about that. We're still working out my access to Zoom, but that's how I'll be holding office hours. So my plan was to hold them tomorrow in place of the ones that should have taken place on Mondays. Typically, office hours will be Mondays from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. So I will email you instructions about that, but just know that we're working that out. The final thing are quizzes. So if you watched the syllabus introduction video, which hopefully you did, you'll notice I mentioned weekly quizzes. This is in the syllabus as well. So originally that would have started this week. And again, these are short kind of comprehension quizzes. So, for example, 3 to 5 questions on the readings or videos or whatever kind of is assigned for the week. Because we are dealing with so much transition and people are just kind of getting to the WordPress site and catching up on things, I'm going to move your first quiz to Monday, or I guess till Tuesday of next week. So I will move it. So don't worry about that for this week. The main thing this week is us all getting on the same page, making sure everyone knows to use the WordPress site, making sure you can contact me via email. Once we get all this stuff up and running, then we'll kind of get into our flow and our rhythm next week. All right, so I wanted to address, I asked you on that very first kind of introductory post for you all to share a little bit about what you hope to discuss this semester. And there were kind of some common themes in here, and I was really excited to hear what you all are looking forward to discussing. A lot of you mentioned, you want to learn more about how we've gotten to contemporary issues, what historical issues have happened to and around the black communities, as well as how those communities have responded. And you'll notice I say communities because, as we'll talk about in a little bit, blackness and being black is such a kind of heterogeneous or large identity. So we'll talk about that. The other thing is, a lot of you, for good reason, you're looking at the news, you're looking at the protests, you're looking at questions of police violence, you're looking at, wealth disparities, and you're trying to figure out how did we get here, right? To learn more about the history of those things. One thing I appreciate is a lot of you seem to bring up and recognize, yes, we have a lot of racism and racial disparities, but we also recognize that there has been certain progress, right? So that kind of balance of seeing where we've progressed, that should say progressed, and where we haven't, right? And understanding the issues right now so that you can be a part of changing them. I think that that is really important. All of these things that you all have mentioned is really what this class is about. So we're going to have a very kind of tailored and focused topic, which I'll get to in a second, but it's all going to tie to this question of what kind of primary historical events or issues have shaped what we're seeing now in the world as it pertains to Black people and Black Americans. And then, how people responded to those, how Black people themselves responded to them, and then how can you all, now that you're understanding these issues, be a part of, the change that we need to continue to push for in this world. So I'm very excited to hear that those are your interests. I'm very passionate about the things we're going to be talking about in this course. And I think that, if you stick with it, especially through this first couple of weeks and the kind of kinks that we're working through in the course and some of the tricky nature of the readings this week, once you really get into things, I think you're going to find that we're going to directly hit on all of these topics. So, to give you some sense of this, again, this will be in the syllabus. So I have this in the syllabus under each week. You'll have your assignments. I'll have this in there. But because I don't have this ready for you yet, because we're waiting to get me that library access, I at least wanted to give you a picture of everything. So you already know last week was introduction, this week keywords and concepts. Again, it's a little heavy or dense, but we're laying the framework or the groundwork for how we're going to analyze and discuss these issues. Next week, we're going to really get into historical foundations. So I'm calling that race and space in the early U.S. We really will look at probably some excerpts from a slave narrative, and then something from kind of after Reconstruction and during the Great Migration, where we had, especially from the South, a lot of Black people migrating to northern city centers. Really, this week 3 is about establishing kind of that early history of the relationship between African Americans or Black Americans and space in the U.S., right? And so, we're talking a little bit about that now, and you've watched the NPR video, so you get a sense of how it's going to be tied to things like neighborhood and housing. But I want to lay the groundwork that this isn't new. It didn't just start with kind of housing, but there's this larger history there. Then weeks 4 and 5, we're going to really get into the very kind of more narrow topic of this course. So I have often argued, and I think I mentioned to you all in the other video, that a lot of this course comes from my own research. And you'll read probably a few short excerpts from my book that's coming out in December on housing segregation and Black life in America. But I often argue that when we look at the question of geographic segregation, it has had as significant an impact on Black Americans in this country as slavery and mass incarceration. And so, I think you don't have to work hard to convince people that slavery, had a big impact. Or today people tend to understand issues of mass incarceration, but not as many people really think about how significant housing segregation was and why that's had such a broad impact. So weeks 4 and 5 will really look at kind of that issue in and of itself, and we'll look at history. We'll talk about the social and economic impacts, right? How we've gotten to the racial wealth gap, some of the things you all mentioned in your comments about access to education, and really kind of digging into those issues. But we'll also start to turn our attention to not just how this has impacted people economically or in terms of where they live, but the social and cultural implications for how Black people and Blackness itself is understood in this country. And that's really the framework of what I often talk about as the streets, right? So you'll see that theme a lot when I talk about, the framing for this course and housing segregation, is that I often argue that the streets are not just this physical space, right, of the ghetto or the hood. It's not just this physical space that Black people were confined to, but it's this larger set of social and cultural meanings that then have become associated with Blackness and Black people themselves. And so to really kind of convince you or teach you about that, week 6 through 14, we're going to look at different kind of mediums in which that happens. So week 6 and 7, we're going to look at consumerism. We'll talk a little bit about how during the kind of housing boom where we had government underwriting of loans, there was this whole new market, right, of home goods. You can imagine people are getting homes for the first time on this widespread level. We have the creation of, the middle class suburbs. So that means people were selling home goods, but it was very much tied to whiteness in the US. So we had the marketing of what came to be kind of the white middle class consumer. What we're going to look at in this class is then what does that mean for the perceptions of Black people as kind of urban renters and consumers. So we'll talk broadly about this and how it's connected to kind of the cultural understandings of Black urbanness and Blackness in general. And then we'll also do some primary sources, and we're actually going to look at some examples from Ebony magazine, which was kind of the flagship magazine for Black marketing. So that'll be week 6 and 7. And then weeks 8 through 10, we're going to turn our lens to literature, right? I promised you, and I think you all have made a good point about asking about this in your post, that we're not just going to look at kind of what happened to Black people in this country, right? Because I think it's important to recognize kind of these larger systemic issues, but it's also really significant that we look at the way that Black people themselves have responded and contested the way that they were being defined and treated. So literature is a medium through which a lot of Black authors talked about their experiences of housing segregation and urban life, and really tried to redefine community and what it means to live in, those spaces. So we'll spend some time on that. And then weeks 11 through 12, we're going to turn to film and television. If you're familiar at all with kind of the hood genre films of the 90s, we'll talk a little bit about those and how that emerged as a way to really kind of give a different picture from the perspective of Black filmmakers of what it meant to be Black and to live in the hood, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll talk how that's grown into shows like The Wire. I don't know if you've seen The Chi, but all these different kind of ways that we depict Black space and particularly Black urban space on screen. Weeks 13 through 14, the last kind of me guiding the conversation, we're going to look at hip hop. You all know, especially because almost all of you are born and raised in New York, I can't tell New Yorkers anything about hip hop because it was born there. So you all know more than anyone that that is a genre of music that was born directly in the streets of New York City. And it actually comes from this history of geographic segregation and the spaces that Black people were confined to, right? And other communities contributed as well. But this is a uniquely kind of Black musical genre that is tied to this history of housing segregation. So we'll look at hip hop in that realm, and then we'll look at the way artists kind of depict their space, right? Both dealing with some of the issues and the things that they face, as well as the way that they challenge the way that they're being defined by the public, right? Especially in the 90s and in the 2000s when people in the public kind of discourse were talking about urban Black youth as, super predators and criminals. Artists use hip hop as a way to challenge that. So we'll look at some of that. And then in the last 2 weeks is when you all are going to present what you think. So I'll spend, again, these first 14 weeks, we're really going to get into the issue of how geographic and housing segregation has shaped Black life in the US, how Black people have responded and contested, those meanings. And then weeks 15 and 16, I want you all to say, I see this at work when I look at this movie or this musician or this marketing campaign or anything else, right? So you'll be in your final project finding a way to present that to us. And it might be in the form of a presentation like this, a video. It might be, many kind of other ways. I'm going to leave it pretty open. But again, I'll post more information on that on Blackboard. But this is just to give you an overview of everything we're going to be doing this semester. And again, if you have questions about any of this, you can email me, especially now that you have my correct email address. So what I want to do now is I want to turn to terms. And this is going to be the kind of big part of today's lecture, or at least this part, this first video, is I want to lay the groundwork for some of the key kind of terms and concepts we're going to be using. I'll get to the keywords essays you read later in a different video, but I want to talk about a few kind of basic things here. So I'm realizing some of you have taken African American Studies courses before, some of you have taken sociology. You're all coming from different places, but and we all have our own different beliefs of what we understand. But when we come into this space together in this class, all I'm asking you to do is say, this is the understanding in this class of how we're going to use and discuss things, right? You don't have to personally necessarily agree, but I'm just going to share with you the way that scholars and other folks who study this, the way they understand and the way we kind of use and analyze these terms. So first things first, race. By now, when I first started teaching on race, and we would talk about race being socially constructed, it was more of a conversation. Now everybody knows that, right? But it's more complicated than that, and we'll revisit this when we get to the keywords essay, because we often now people will say, well, it's just socially constructed, and they leave it at that. But it has so much more meaning than just saying it's just a socially constructed thing. But it is important that we do understand this definition. And this is my side hint to you that when I put some of these definitions and things up here, these might be things that, on your exam, I might say, define race for me, or tell me, how did we go from race being seen as a quote unquote scientific idea to a social one, right? So FYI, things you may want to take note of. So socially constructed, I think this is key. Race is really, and this is when you understand it as a historical process. When we say socially constructed, it means it's been constructed by society through historical and political and economic processes, right? So it's external. As much as we want to, maybe people want to choose or say, the way that we in the academy talk about race is something that is socially constructed and it's often externally kind of put onto you, right? You are racialized by the world. It is often connected to ethnic and cultural identity, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Actually, I'll just go right into that. So ethnicity, and these are often conflated, even by the census, which I hate because they mix up race and ethnicity all the time. Ethnicity is also socially constructed, which sounds weird because you might think, well, like being, Ethiopian or being, Ecuadorian, those aren't socially constructed, although that has more to do with nationality than anything. It's socially constructed in the fact that over time and generations, a society has come together to define their culture, to develop their language, their ancestry, maybe how their ethnicity is tied to a particular national identity. That's what I mean by it being socially constructed. But ethnicity is more largely tied to, it's the people themselves who define it, right? So, if you ask people in Taiwan what it means to be Taiwanese today, or particularly more specifically, if you ask someone, who speaks Cantonese about that culture and their maybe ethnic background, that's defined with the people who have that ethnicity and that culture, which is different from race, which is external, right? These are conflated, and so one way that you will understand this better than what seems like the rest of the world is that you only have one race, right? But you often can have multiple ethnicities. And even today, which it's very recent, maybe in the last 20 years or so, that we've had mixed race become its own racial category, that in and of itself becomes someone's race, right? So we talk about people being mixed, which we'll get to that, and we'll talk a little bit about that, the issues with some of how that works. But racial identity tends to be, again, the way you're racialized. You're black, you're white, you're mixed, you're Asian. And you'll notice even the language around it is kind of messed up, right? Like Asian becomes a race. Or people often use Latinx as a race, but it's not a racial category. It's so much more complicated than that. But ethnicity, you might have multiple. So I tend to use myself as an example, and you can't see me right now. You see me in other videos, and some of my other recordings, I'll also probably switch back and forth between slides and you seeing me. I am very, clearly a black woman, but I am a multi-ethnic black woman. One of my parents is African American, the other parent is Ethiopian. Being in New York, you all see this all the time, right? I think a big way this comes up often are with people who are black, but are Latinx, right? So they might talk about themselves as being Afro-Latinx, or they might say, I'm black, but I'm Dominican, right? Or they might try to not say they're black, but it's very complicated, partially because the way that we personally relate to our race or ethnicity is so kind of wrapped up in our interactions and the ways we want to be seen versus the ways that we are seen, right? So again, I'm not asking you to, change maybe your mind about all of this, but at least to understand that this is the way that the people who study and work with this and analyze these issues see it, and that's the way we're kind of going to use this in this class. Oh, one last thing on culture I didn't mention. So culture is the one thing that is a lot more fluid, right? So maybe you talk about people who see themselves as third culture kids, or if you think of people, for example, who are like transracial adoptions, you might be, racially, that is, you have your race, you're racialized, that's what you are. Ethnically, that tends to be tied to your heritage or where you come from. But culturally, you might be something completely different, right? Often ethnicity and culture are tied together, but not always. So I just want to clarify kind of those three terms. I want to talk a little bit here, because this is a class that is a, African American studies or more widely kind of Black studies course, about Blackness and whiteness in particular in the U.S. And I'm spending some time on this because, again, depending on what classes you've taken and where you come from, this may be new or it may not. So I have a couple of quotes here, and you'll notice that I really like that Keywords for American Cultural Studies. It's a great book where you've had experts and scholars from different fields. Whether American Studies is interdisciplinary, so you might have someone that does literature or economics or poli-sci or ethnic studies, and all these folks are coming together to provide these kind of research definitions of how we understand things. So Blackness and whiteness, I wanted to put these together because a lot of how we're going to discuss, housing segregation and geographic segregation and its relationship to race, even though we're focusing on Black communities, Black histories, Black experiences, it's often going to be in conjunction with whiteness because historically in the U.S., these two have been defined against one another. And even when you look at race in the U.S. as a hierarchy, this is not a surprise to you. Typically that hierarchy has whiteness at the top, Blackness at the bottom, and then different groups have moved around in between, right? A good example of this would be, and we'll get to this in a little bit, historically, for example, Eastern Europeans or Irish people who were lower on the racial hierarchy before they kind of moved into a wider conception of whiteness. Or you might look at people of Asian descent, right? So historically, before 1965, they were towards the very bottom of the social hierarchy. Chinese people were excluded from immigrating to the U.S. in the late 1800s. And then we had a whole Asiatic exclusion zone that kept people from immigrating here, and lots of laws that made them, poor workers. But when we came with the 1965 Immigration Act, that changed, and we've had a very different wave of immigration, in a sense of, that new model minority myth, right? It's also tied to civil rights and attempting to undermine some of that, but that's a conversation for another class. So all that to say that often when we talk about race in this country, and blackness and whiteness in particular, we always have to think about these in relationship to one another. So I wanted to go over some of these terms because I think it would be a disservice to you if I didn't at least make sure we had a shared knowledge of what we mean when we say Black, African American, or when we look at historical terms like Negro, colored, other things like that. So Black, again, is a more of an umbrella term for people who are of African descent, right? So, it has fluid meaning outside of the US as well. It's tied to historical and geographical context. So, for example, if you are familiar at all with Australia, a lot of the Aboriginal people there, they are called and call themselves Black, right? So historically, even before it got tied to people of African descent, it's always been kind of this term that's associated with a particular place in a racial or caste hierarchy. But it's broad, so I want that to be very clear, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the history. So originally, when people were enslaved, people were talked about as Africans, or they were talked about as the N-word, right? Those were the terms that were used. It wasn't until, we got a little bit further on that words like colored or Negro became the prominent way that Black people were talked about, or that they talked about themselves. I will say that Black as a term really emerged after emancipation, and that was something that people like W.E.B. Du Bois and other Black scholars and activists use as a way to redefine themselves, to say, I'm Black, and this is my response to white supremacy. I'm not your Negro, I'm not colored, I'm a Black person. And they use that to kind of define their race and their identity in certain ways. Again, they're racialized as Black, but they took a new term to try to kind of associate new meanings with that. You probably are familiar, and you see this picture here of the New Negro movement and the Harlem Renaissance. That was similar, right? To say, you may have called me a Negro, but this is my new definition of that. So a lot of times it's important to know that these terms have shifted, they're fluid, they've been contested, where people try to really negotiate the meanings that are being pushed onto them versus how they want to be seen and understood. It wasn't until maybe the 1980s that the term African American really became popular. It's interesting because the history of this has been really difficult to trace. Some people trace it back to this poem that was written by an African American veteran who kind of played with the wording here to say, like, African, like an American, like he played with the wording of being American and being African and I can. But today, what I'll say is you kind of have people go back and forth in their preference. Some people prefer strongly to be Black, partially because they don't want to limit themselves to kind of U.S. identity, that they feel it connects them more to people who are Black in other countries. You have people who also choose the word Black because they think it acknowledges the way that they've lost some of that connection to Africa, right? Because of the transatlantic slave trade, they don't feel like they have that history or that connection. Alternatively, for the very same reason, you have people who say, I want to be called African American, I want to be called African, right? If you refer to Africana studies, because I connect myself to Africa and that heritage. Or because they're being really specific to their identity as descendants of enslaved people in the US, right? So again, on the ground, people are going to have very different reasons why they choose or use these terms. But something clear for this class to distinguish is when we talk about Black and Blackness, we're talking on one hand about this kind of wide category of anybody of African descent throughout the diaspora. And we're talking about a kind of racial category that has come out of this history of white supremacy, right? And you see this quote by Keaton, who you read her essay. I think it's really pertinent to understanding this, where she says, the social and legal principle of the one-drop rule, white supremacy's definition of Blackness, exemplifies the point that asserts that African ancestry, real or imagined, defines a person as Black and thus inferior. So that's the history of where it came from, but again, people have contested that. They are obviously saying, I'm not inferior, but that being of African ancestry is really in the US in particular, but now kind of globally, is how we define Blackness. That leads me to kind of the term mixed, right? So again, very recently, people have embraced mixed as this way of saying, well, I'm not really black or I'm not really white, I'm both. And I think that, it's complicated because on one hand, there are struggles of people who maybe feel ethnically or culturally like they don't belong in, their particular communities, or they've struggled with those identities. Arguably, that's true of people who are black as well. I think everybody goes through that to a degree, right? People who maybe feel that they don't fit particular stereotypes or norms, right? But really, that's more your view of the stereotype or the norm than it is your actual identity. So that's a newer thing, but historically, if you are of African ancestry, regardless of if you're mixed or not, that makes you black. You can be black and something else, but it would make you black. Within that, I tend to, and other scholars tend to say, African American really operates more like a ethnic group, right? If you think about it in the US, I mean, we're going to see in this class, there is a whole set of African American literature, of music, of food, of cultural practices, just like any other ethnic group. It's born out of unique circumstances, right? But there is a culture and identity to being African American. So it becomes its own kind of ethnic identity where you are black, but maybe you are also African American. You might be black and Jamaican or black and Dominican, and there's a strong history in this country of people who were black but were not African American, who are a big part of pushing for racial equality. So a little bit of context for that. I think I'm going to briefly talk to you about whiteness, simply because I think it's important to offer this contrast here. So please, everybody, maybe if the whole world got this memo, we can stop using the word Caucasian, because that really comes out of a history of pseudoscience, where this one prominent person made a case that that white people were Caucasian because they looked like, people from this particular mountain range, and that was the cradle of life, which we all know now is not true. But really, all that matters is that we're understanding this as a category that has both been defined against blackness, but also has been seen as the norm. I will mention to you that both of these categories, and we'll circle back to this later, really came out of this sense, originally this belief that race was biological, but throughout time in the US, there was an acknowledgement that actually it's more social. So I put this US case here, US v. Thind, which is this really famous court case where this Indian man made an argument that he could trace back his ancestry to being Aryan, and because of that, he should be considered legally white. And in the court case, actually cited that white was really what the common man's understanding of it was, right? So that began the first kind of acknowledgement that it's really about how people understand whiteness to be, rather than some kind of scientific basis. What I really think is the most relevant point to this case, because I could talk about this forever and I won't spend forever on this, is this quote from another keyword essay on whiteness, and you can find this one online actually if you're interested, where we say whiteness as is a set of cultural, political, and behavioral norms by which difference, deficiency, truth, and justice are determined. The normative character of whiteness is well illustrated in ethnographic studies revealing that most white U.S. Americans will say that they have no racial identity, culture, or advantages as whites. They are just normal, quote unquote. So this is really the crux of a lot of what we're going to be looking at in this class, is if whiteness is kind of the default or seen as the norm, then what does that say, or what happens historically to blackness? Especially if we understand these two as historically being understood as opposites, right? So if whiteness becomes the default norm, then what does that mean for blackness? So when we look at space and how that shaped kind of U.S. identity and politics and sense of belonging, we're going to look at what happens not only with white space and white identity, but then what that means for black space and black identity. So I think I'm going to skip this for sake of time. I want to make sure I'm not going too long on this. I will say, if you're interested in some of this, office hours, I'm happy to discuss it. One slight thing, so you understand the way kind of race and whiteness and have worked. We know very clearly more kind of where blackness comes from, especially the history of slavery. But people often talk about the U.S. as a melting pot, but rarely people know that that actually was a term that was first used just to describe whiteness. So it was more that originally in the US you had to be a WASP, which you all hopefully know that term is white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, to be at kind of the top rungs of society. But in the late 1800s, where we had more immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, and we had emancipation, right? So now we have free people of African descent. So it changed the racial dynamic, which means that whiteness itself had to kind of broaden to solidify power. And so we had the promotion of a melting pot, which is actually used as a metaphor just to talk about assimilating these different European groups into whiteness, not to talk about maybe today how we often talk about the US as a kind of multiracial, multi-ethnic society. So another thing that you want to take notes on, don't panic about all of this. I know it's a lot of words on the screen. But racial formations, I just want you to understand maybe the concept and racial projects, because this is really what this class is entirely about. So in a nutshell, there are these sociologists that had this foundational work, Omni and Winant, that kind of shaped a lot of how people understand and discuss race. And really their argument is what I've already said to you, is that a racial formation is just that process by which the social, economic, and political forces determine the content and importance of racial categories. So the ways in which social, economic, and political forces determine, the meaning of blackness, right? And that's what this class is about. We're going to look at social, economic, and political forces related to housing and where you belong in which spaces and how that shaped the understanding and the content of blackness itself in the US. So we're going to be looking at this particular racial formation that came out of the history of housing segregation. So that's a key term that you kind of want to know. And it often takes place through what we call our racial projects. So that's just the way in media, in marketing, in literature, in film, those are all projects, right? It's just kind of the cultural means through which we assign meaning to particular races, genders, etc., right? So a good example of this I like to show, let's see if it'll let me click it, are back in the 1800s when people were really debating some of these immigrant groups, not that we're not doing that now, we had magazines and newspapers were the primary means through which people kind of had these public conversations. And so these cartoons were published as a way to kind of put forth a kind of thesis or an argument about whether or not certain groups belonged. This is a primary example of a racial project. This one in particular was about the Chinese, right? And Chinese immigrants. And you'll notice here that this person has these contrasting images, right? They're peaceable and they show the person with the axe. They're clean and they show them, living in squalor. This is a racial project that is attempting to racialize, we use that as a verb, people of Chinese descent as dirty and violent. And it's people who didn't belong in the US, right? And that had consequences, right? If you're familiar with 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, these ideas, these racial projects that circulate through media, through other means, begin to influence our dominant perceptions, and they have effects on the way people interact, as well as in the laws and the structures that determine, what rights people have. And so when we look at this, it's a really clear example of the way, things in culture are connected to questions of power, politics, belonging, rights. We don't often connect things like magazines or television to those things like rights, but they are connected, and that's really what this theory of racial formations and racial projects is about. You'll notice that I use the term racialized, or you might hear me say something is gendered. It's really just a verb for talking about how something is assigned meaning, right? So housework, not surprising. You all know that tends to be gendered as feminine, right? Sports tend to be gendered as masculine, right? We know that people tend to watch and pay more for sports performed by men. So these are just examples of this. And one side note I always like to tell people in a class is don't feel guilty if if I told you all to close your eyes right now, and I can't see you, and to picture a basketball player, first thing that's going to come to your mind, likely, if you are like most people, is a picture of a black male, right? And that's not because there aren't people who aren't black or who aren't male who are basketball players, but because that is the dominant kind of way that basketball players have been gendered as male and racialized as black. And you might say to yourself, but yeah, but most basketball players are black and are male. Well, one, probably not true when we say most basketball players because there's a lot of different leagues and people in the world. But two, it becomes this catch-22, which is important to acknowledge. We have a dominant ideology about what a sport or a career or any other thing looks like. And so then the people who fit that tend to go into it, and then that particular sport, career, etc. continues to have that meaning assigned to it. So it almost becomes this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. My point though is that when I had you close your eyes and envision something, is that we have been socialized to see certain things in certain ways. So you don't feel guilty about that, but I think what's great about classes like this is it gives you the opportunity to understand why it is that if I close your eyes and I tell you to picture the ghetto, you're going to picture a city and you're going to picture black people probably. Why is that? Well, that's what we're going to get into in this class. If I tell you to picture the suburbs, you're going to picture a cookie cutter house and probably a white, family with a husband, wife, and 2.5 kids. Why is that? And so we're going to get into in this class where those things come from and how that process of assigning those meanings, came about. So the last thing I want to do today is I love using Google as a litmus test for some of these when we talk about kind of dominant ideologies or the ways that things have been racialized or gendered. A really good example of that is Google, simply because if you've used Google Images, which I'm hoping this will record, when you search, it gives you the images that are most closely associated with that term. And it's not foolproof, right? It's kind of the great thing about Google, is you'll see some kind of anomalies in there, but it gives you a broad stroke sense of the way that as a society, we tend to perceive certain things. So a quick example is if I put in here teacher, you'll notice as I scroll, mostly women. You get, one male presenting person. Interesting now in this time, you see someone with a mask, but heavily tends to be gendered female. We're seeing some kind of diverse looks here, a lot of white females, right? But it's interesting to think about the way this profession then is gendered and racialized. Now, if I put professor, interesting, right? If you think about it, a lot of men, a lot of white men, tends to be somewhat older. Again, some differences here, and that's important to acknowledge, but it gives us an interesting broad stroke of the way that a profession like being a professor is gendered and racialized versus being a teacher. I'll do one more and then we'll leave it at that because I love doing this. So, patriot. Super weird in this moment to kind of think about this. And again, it's Google. So part of it is you think about the way that that concept has been commodified, right? That a car is one of the things that comes up. Television shows, our current president, we see from films, but typically it's kind of gendered and racialized as kind of this white male identity, right? Even the ruggedness of a Jeep tends to be, gendered in particular ways. And if I put terrorist in, hopefully I'm not going to get in trouble for my Google history now, you'll see some interesting things. And this has changed in the years that I've taught, right? Obviously, because we've been at war for the last 20 plus years with the Middle East, you tend to see the way that now as a society that we perceive terrorists is racialized and gendered as being of Arab descent and being Middle Eastern, right? That would have been very different in the mid 20th century, where the people who were accused to be terrorists mostly were people who are of Eastern European descent, people who are perceived to be socialists, It's changed over time, right? But because of our context and where we're at, these are the things that tend to be associated with it. Many more guns, right? So the way that kind of violence is associated with that particular racial and gendered identity is interesting. So all I'm really trying to get at as we kind of get started on this course is to think through, this is really a class, we're going to look at the very specific issue of Blackness and space and how that's shaped kind of the lives and opportunities and realities for Black people in the US, as well as the way that Blackness has understood itself. But also on a wider scale, I want you to be thinking about the ways in which in everyday kind of media and culture, we assign meanings to different groups and ideas and people and careers, because that's a lot of the ways and the kind of thinking that we're going to be doing in this course. So I know this video went a little long, the other ones will be shorter, but I thought it was important that we kind of lay this foundation for the course before we kind of keep going. If you have questions about any of this, you can shoot me an email or post it on the course page. And then again, office hours are usually a great place to come and chat about these.